The year was 1945. The empire had ended, yet its remains continued to suffer. Major urban centers spanning Hamburg to Dresden, Munich to Königsberg were now merely mass burial sites. Utilities like water and power vanished. Chaos reigned supreme. Parents cooked anything available. Scraps of potatoes, greenery, or masonry fragments were utilized for meager nourishment to trick the hunger. Conflict had breached private residences. Failure, meanwhile, permeated the very core of the populace. Near the Berlin suburbs, mothers pulled wagons containing offspring, either resting or deceased, shielded only by linens or by utter numbness. A few donned festive garments caked in grime, the solitary relic that escaped the flames. The idea of a residence had evaporated. Barriers offered no security. Roadways pointed toward no tomorrow. Neighbors monitored one another due to anxiety or starvation. Everything had transformed since that version of Germany in 1933. The ascent of Hitler and the fantasy of the Teutonic laborer. That morning on the 30th of January 1933 delivered no gusts of combat or omens of catastrophe. Within Berlin, the winter remained typically lackluster, and streetcars continued grinding against frozen tracks. However, a unique sensation lingered. Broadcasters stated that Hindenburg had selected Adolf Hitler as the chancellor. To many, it represented just another event in a shaky series of regimes. To others, it was a moment of suppressed excitement destined to flood the boulevards. That evening, lanterns lit up the Brandenburg Gate. Myriads of followers marched down Unter den Linden, shouting, clutching crimson banners featuring dark swastikas centered in pale circles. Whole households gathered on balconies to observe the display as though it were a holy rite. There existed bliss, optimism, a feeling that the unthinkable, the salvation of Germany, had commenced. Currency devaluation, joblessness, the shames from the Treaty of Versailles, the political volatility of the Weimar Republic. All of those issues seemed finally to be beginning to vanish. It was not merely a partisan triumph. It was a shared pledge of deliverance. Within the proletarian districts of Berlin, the response was hesitant. Certain people viewed that martial procession with doubt, recalling the violence inflicted by the paramilitary groups in earlier years. Nevertheless, even there, amidst poverty and skepticism, comments like, "Perhaps now circumstances will shift," passed through. Despair leaves no space for ethics when the belly is hollow and the coming days are a shadow. The middle class, particularly modest retailers, staff, and pensioners, was the group that most rapidly welcomed the revamped regime. They had been the primary casualties of the 1920s, targets of hyperinflation that drained their wealth, of labor strikes, of unrest, and of factions that vowed everything but delivered nothing. When Hitler discussed ethnic harmony, of becoming powerful once more, of stability and control, many believed that finally an individual was restoring their self-respect. On Sundays at the cafes, they no longer debated solely the cost of grain. They discussed the future. On a mundane scale, the transition was swift. In classrooms, images of President Hindenburg were swapped for those of Hitler. In public squares, youngsters practiced saluting with their limbs extended. In storefronts, several traders spontaneously discarded foreign-sourced items. In sanctuaries, homilies started mentioning the sacred awakening of the German populace. There were not yet statutes. There were not yet detention centers. There were not yet regalia for everyone. But a specific terminology was starting to take root. The rhetoric of banishment, of arrogance, of ethnic fate. Receiving devices sold incredibly fast. The Volksempfänger set, the national receiver, was debuted that very year. Inexpensive and basic, it was crafted so that millions could hear the messages of the revamped commander. And they listened in kitchens, in garages, in salons. Hitler's speech drifted through partitions like an ever-present ghost. His piercing pitch, his oracular rhythm, his resolute certainty persuaded many who had never explored his autobiography nor entirely grasped what he was proclaiming. But he appeared sincere. He appeared powerful. And during times of turmoil, power is convincing. The youth units started to expand. Myriads of adolescents joined the Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls. Not all joined from belief. Many participated because their peers were already involved, because their guardians advised it, or because it was the path to belonging. The tan outfits, the emblems, the melodies, the wilderness treks, the activities with blades, the hikes through the timberland. All of that fostered a sense of community that no academy or church had managed to provide previously. At home, the shift also showed itself in minor acts, familial notes that mentioned hope after evening chats, where dissidents were attacked with more vigor, slights toward Jewish people that had once been quiet and were now expressed with laughter. A merchant who stuck a notice in his window stating Aryan commerce. Not from belief, but because the neighbor had done so too, and he did not wish to be neglected because neutrality was no longer feasible. Either you cheered or you kept quiet. And quietness in that revamped regime was also considered suspicious. The 1st of May Workers' Day was converted into a state celebration. Instead of labor demonstrations, there were spectacles, pyrotechnics, spheres, and nationalist oratory. Millions joined, oblivious that the following morning the government would violently dissolve the independent labor unions and establish the German Labor Front under partisan management. Thus, while citizens rejoiced in the avenues, proletarian autonomy perished in quiet. No one objected, some from dread, most from apathy, others because they truly felt that this was the proper way. By the conclusion of that initial year, many Germans felt that conditions had indeed progressed. Joblessness was starting to fade due to civil engineering initiatives. Superhighways, arenas, and communal housing were being constructed. Pledges became results, and that was more than any recent administration had provided. The queues to obtain grain were briefer, the boulevards tidier, the locomotives more punctual. The government appeared active, capable, and universal, although it was already understood that behind that capability there was coercion. The first partisan liquidations were executed in the darkness. The communist organization was outlawed. Its commanders were seized or vanished. Some entered exile. The Social Democrats shortly endured a similar fate. The media was aligned. The broadcasting hubs were centralized, and literature was audited. Many civilians did not consume the reports about the internment facilities established in Dachau or Oranienburg. Not because they were concealed, but because they no longer mattered. They must have done something, citizens remarked, or simply uttered nothing. In familial gatherings, governance was no longer debated, or it was discussed with platitudes, with excerpts from the leader, with knowing grins, because everyone understood that the neighbor was eavesdropping, that the relative could inform, that the merchant, the educator, even one's own offspring could recount what they heard at school. Denouncing became a quiet ritual of steadfastness, a path for promotion, for vendetta, or merely for dread, and dread started to seep into residences, into chambers, into stillness. 1934 to 1935. The imposition of social regulation and the start of the synchronization. The early passion of the year 1933 did not evaporate instantly. The boulevards of Germany stayed adorned with crimson banners. The broadcasters tirelessly echoed the orations of the leader, and communal fervor was still clear in the prolonged salutations in adolescent parades, in the packed arenas during nationalist festivals. But as 1934 moved forward, the passion started to evolve into something more nuanced and stifling, a pattern of perpetual compliance, a lifestyle that demanded wariness, silence, and, most of all, agreement. Synchronization, the complete alignment of the person with the goals of the partisan state, was not yet a familiar term in residences, but it was already a daily fact. German communal life started to be structured under an unofficial but universal monitoring mechanism. In districts, local groups became webs of ideological surveillance. Classic street corner conversations fell under scrutiny. On every block, a block leader functioned as a bridge between the party and the people. He might be a retailer, a janitor, a retiree. His history was irrelevant. Now his task was to log, observe, and notify. He frequently knew all the residents by name, and everyone identified him. He did not need to speak. His mere presence sufficed to keep discussions within authorized limits. In residences, guardians learned to weigh their speech. Offspring returned from academy, echoing lines from the leader, chanting nationalist tunes, asking if greetings at home matched those in class. School was now an annex of the party. Educators, some firm believers, others merely compliant, had been fused into the National Socialist Teachers League. The data in study materials had been shifted. History started in 1914 and concluded in 1933, as if the Weimar era had been a brief blur. Biology became a mechanism to describe ethnic variances. Math was shown with tasks regarding the expense of caring for a chronically ill person. German was utilized to read and learn parts of Mein Kampf. Guardians who disagreed learned to stay quiet. Some incinerated literature on their own whim. Others concealed pictures of Jewish kinsmen. Some simply ceased discussing politics. It was simpler to instruct offspring to echo what they heard elsewhere, even if they did not feel it internally. In tiny hamlets, that deception was even more obvious. Everyone identified one another. Everyone knew who had been a Marxist, who held progressive thoughts, who had collaborated with Jews. But now everyone acted as if they had always been steadfast. Forgetting became a survival tactic. Employment also did not avoid the revamped regime. Since the breaking of the labor unions, every worker fell under the guidance of the German Labor Front. There were no more pay talks or shared requests. Walkouts vanished instantly. The mood in plants shifted. People toiled more, spoke less. Staff vied to appear more steadfast, who saluted first, who displayed the party banner in the workplace, who gave more to the winter relief drives. Career talent started to matter less than partisan membership. Advancement and firing were often settled based on what one signified for the revamped regime. Women were summoned to inhabit a specific and restricted position. Parents and protectors of the residents. The German Women's Agency and the Nazi Women's League handled gatherings, state culinary courses, discussions on ethnic cleanliness, meetings to stitch and instruct new cohorts. At a quick look, it appeared like a domestic aid web, but every gathering included catchphrases, melodies, and ideological coaching. The perfect German female was resilient, childbearing, and compliant. The state required her not only to produce offspring, but future combatants. Those who toiled outside the residence started to be seen with doubt. In workplaces, mail centers, clinics, they were cautioned that their real spot was in the kitchen, not at a desk. Leisure was also restructured. The Strength Through Joy group provided trips, classes, shows, and play activities for laborers. At a quick look, it was a gain in lifestyle, but every trip was joined by icons, oratory, and banners. Every melody practiced held a partisan theme. Germans started to exist in a framework where even relaxation was managed. The notion of choosing how to utilize time started to vanish. The press was one of the first total targets of the synchronization. In 1934, most neutral gazettes had vanished or had been swallowed by firms aligned with the party. Consuming the news became a dull, certain act. All the reports were positive. Germany was waking. The wealth increased. The leader was adored. Unpleasant reports were what was omitted. In some residences, old gazettes from before 1933 were kept as treasures, or tiny illegal receivers caught external signals, but utilizing them was a needless hazard. Listening to an external hub could mean jail. Discussing what was heard, something worse. In 1934, the government solidified its grip through homicide. On the 30th of June, during the period titled the Night of the Long Knives, the brown shirts, the primary militants of the Nazi cause, were purged. Ernst Röhm and other commanders were executed by specific instructions from Hitler. The incident was narrated to the populace as a protective step, a guarding of stability, and many trusted it or acted like they did because homicide no longer triggered outrage. It was defended. It was vital. The notion of fairness started to be blurred with compliance. Rules were no longer meant to shield, but to control. The passing of Hindenburg in August of 1934 finished the story of the Republic. Hitler took the title of Führer and Chancellor, merging the role of state head and government head. A state vote was set up to validate this shift. The bulk voted affirmatively in a world of stress, monitoring, and spin. Participation was required. Slips were placed in watched boxes. In many hamlets, neighbors identified who had not participated. Democracy, already weakened, was interred with state respect. Most civilians did not grieve its exit. Quiet seemed to matter more than liberty. Jewish people started to be steadily pushed out of daily life. In 1935, the Nuremberg Statutes formalized bigotry, but even prior to that, it was visible in common life. In eateries, some notices stated, "Jews forbidden." In lenders, tasks became hard if the name was Semitic. In bazaars, some women avoided buying at non-Aryan depots. Physical harm was not vital. Communal shunning was enough. The gaze that shifted away, the greeting that was no longer given. Jewish people, until then members of the German group, started to vanish from the view without the need for yelling. Quiet alone was enough. In merely 2 years, German communal territory was entirely redefined. Strolling down a lane was a trip filled with icons, swastikas on every structure, regalia everywhere, images of the leader in academies, depots, clinics. Discussions were monitored, feelings weighed. In the secret of the residence, some still recalled the recent era, but the current time was steadily harder, louder. Opposing was risky. Merging was simpler. And most picked to merge. Legal and communal banishment of the Jews and non-Aryans. The German boulevards stayed tidy, systematic, adorned with crimson banners that dangled like endless drapes of a static theater. The broadcasters still played nationalist marches. The youngsters still sang tunes of the Hitler Youth, and the partisan staff strolled on the paths as if they were protectors of a higher code. But something in the view was starting to fade, not with noise, not yet with overt harm, but with a steady departure. The Jewish households who, for ages, had shared eateries, archives, lenders, academies, and societies with their peers, were starting to become ghost-like. Not because they were lurking, but because the rest ceased looking. Starting in 1935, the path of banishment became statute. On the 15th of September, during the partisan event in Nuremberg, the government stated the passage of the laws for the shielding of German blood and honor and the state citizenship law. From that point on, the existences of myriads of individuals shifted in a savage way. The Jews stopped being German inhabitants. They surrendered their statehood. They surrendered basic communal rights, such as participating in elections, taking state roles, or wedding non-Jews. But beyond the legal text, what shifted for them and for everyone was the mood. Banishment became formal, endorsed, managed. In common existence, the effects were quickly perceived. In the eateries, previous Jewish guests stopped coming. Some were quietly shoved out. Others grasped that they were not desired. Depot owners who kept vending to Jews got threats, nameless memos, visits from brown shirt members. The Aryan hair salons posted notices stating that they did not help non-Germans. The clinics that still filled orders from Jewish medics were watched. At a quick look, no one blocked anything with yells, but everyone grasped that the boundary had already been etched. In academies, Jewish youngsters started to be split. First they were bypassed, then mocked, finally divided. The heads who had to report how many non-Aryan pupils there were defended the moves as a goal for teaching balance. In biology hours, pupils learned to scale heads, to find ethnic traits to pinpoint flawed kinds. The youngsters echoed without grasping, but they learned to view with doubt the peer whose name did not sound enough German. At break, the activities no longer brought in everyone. Shoves and grins blended with jeers, spitting, and hate. Artistic life also shifted. Theaters started to drop films made or acted by Jews. Stages fired performers and musicians with wrong names. Firms halted deals. Colleges ended roles. But none of this occurred in secret. Catalogs were issued. Swaps were stated. The cleaning of the German soul was honored. The public, with minor exceptions, took the shifts as usual. Some objected quietly. Others mourned them in private. But no one dared to pen a note to endorse a gripe, to lift a palm at a meeting. In districts, communal bonds started to snap. Peers who had once shared chats, meals, or parties with Jewish households started to shun them. Not all from belief, many from dread. A visit, a bad word, a grin at the wrong second could be watched. The block leader took a note, and the hazard was true. A solitary tip, nameless, wrong, or hateful, was enough for a resident to be probed, grilled, jailed. Thus, bonds became suspect. Greeting became risky and quiet, a shield. The heartfelt effects were ruinous. Jewish households existed under endless stress. They had to tell their youngsters why they could no longer attend the same academy, why their parent could no longer buy in a specific depot, why they were no longer called to parties. Many sought to keep habits, reading, learning, visiting elders, penning notes. But the weeks were packed with no's, with shut gates, with gazettes that shifted away. Some sought to merge. Others started to make schemes to leave. But getting a stamp, a pass, a spot was steadily hard. The planet was not opening. It was shutting. A way most German residents were starting to accept that banishment. They did not ponder it. They did not doubt it. They simply kept on with their existences. Some even honored it. The government's spin handled defending everything. The Jews were blamed for the losses, for the misery of the post-war era, for artistic decay, for the global plot. Kids' books showed ugly sketches. The news clips in theaters played orations that mentioned ethnic hygiene. The terms were echoed so much that they lost their weight. No one fought against them because they had learned not to fight. The banishment also reached other sets. The Roma, the gay people, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the impaired started to feel the load of the state on their limbs. But the resident crowd barely found out, or they found out and did not ask. What was not seen did not sting, and what was seen was taken with surrender. The synchronization had not only aligned groups, it had aligned minds. The typical resident knew what to say, what to hide, what to view, and what to bypass. They learned to exist within the edges, and not to assist those who were left away. On the radio, Hitler's orations became more fierce. There were terms about purity, about fate, about the task of the German crowd. In the arenas, salutations grew. The masses echoed with care each move, each catchphrase. But under that timing, there was a deep surrender, the surrender of the other. The German crowd, for the most part, took that there were residents who had to be left out, who did not gain the same rights, who were not part of the whole. And that taking, although quiet, allowed everything that would occur later. In state offices, staff started to get new papers. In them, the ethnic root of parents and elders had to be declared. It was not enough to be German. It had to be shown. And that proof became a need for everything. To wed, to toil, to learn. Those who could not show full Aryan status were dropped, sometimes without words, other times with notes that mentioned the needs of the empire. The crowd who had once been full residents became inhabitants without rights. Their history, their task, their love for the land did not matter. A solitary line in their tree was enough to turn them into pariahs. In mixed households, the stress was heavy. A Jewish spouse, a non-Aryan parent, a changed kinsman were enough to snap entire frames. Some picked parting, others were made to quit. There were those who ended it or vanished. Familial meetings became seconds of dread. Who would go? What could be said? Who would be the first to tip off the other? Because now belonging was not artistic. It was physical, and no one could shift it. And yet, in the middle of that ghost-like move of gloom, common existence kept on. Locomotives came on time. Bakeries opened. Parks were packed with youngsters. Women waited at the bazaar. Men read the Gazette. Germany did not appear like a tyranny. It appeared like a land in order, tidy, at peace. But under that shell, a precise tool of banishment, of hiding, of slow ruin moved. The German crowd, for the most part, did not ask for blood. They did not ask for camps. They did not ask for riots. But they did take day after day the ghost-like exit of the Jewish peer. They took their quiet, their inner move, their steady push away, not from open hate, but from structural apathy, from dread, from habit. Because the tool of the Third Empire was not kept only by force, it was kept by the ease of those who picked not to view. In 1935 and 1936, Germany was not yet a jail camp. It was a systematic, zealous, firm group. But in that zeal, the tragedy was already lurking, because every grin at seeing the young uniformed walk, every sign of favor at seeing a Jewish depot shut, every whisper that honored ethnic purity, was another brick on the path to the pit. Mass culture, spin, and training from youth. Communal existence in Germany in the middle 30s moved in a steadily stiff, certain order, packed with icons. Everything was wrapped in a pattern of forced zeal. On the shell, the land was moving. New roads cut through country views like tidy marks. Locomotives came on time. Hamlets were adorned with blooms and swastikas. German and external guests spoke of tidiness, move, and fit youth. But behind every card, a system of partisan control that never rested was being made stronger. And that control started in the most tender spot, the youngsters. From the early years of existence, German youth was made by a deeply partisan learning. State-run nurseries brought in activities and tunes that honored love for the land, compliance to the leader, and shunning of the inner foe. Educators trained in schools where ethnic teaching was given spoke of purity of blood with the same ease with which they taught math. Every sketch on the partitions held swastikas and nationalist terms written in young script. Every move, every catchphrase, every active activity served one solitary goal: to make compliant, resilient, and helpful Germans for the empire. At 10 years of age, males joined the Hitler Youth and females the League of German Girls. From then on, spare time stopped being truly free. Eves were packed with walking, chanting, body training, nature tasks, communal toil, and partisan coaching. Weekends were for tents or visiting the shrine of some old fight. Breaks were set in partisan camps. Even kids' birthday events were utilized to bolster control. The youngsters saluted the leader, were instructed to look with pride at the image on the partition, and to doubt anything variant. Academy learning was also entirely given to the state. History started with Germanic power and ended with the arrival of Hitler. The old past was honored. The loss of 1918 was explained as a stab in the back made by Jews, Marxists, and inner foes. Geography taught the lost German lands as a future vow of growth. Body science was utilized to describe the power of the Nordic race. Gym took more hours than books. The body had to be resilient, helpful, tough. Thinking was viewed with doubt. The goal was a pupil who walked, echoed, and complied. At home, many parents backed this path with real zeal, but others did so from dread. Banning a child from the youth sets was seen as a bad act. There were times where youngsters themselves tipped off their guardians for thoughts against the state soul. Such tales were told with dark pride. The party honored that kind of loyalty. Thus, a new code was made, where compliance to the state was above familial ties. In the core of the residence, doubt was born. Common culture was another tool of control. The press was strictly watched. Radios, inexpensive and everywhere, only played sanctioned music, state orations, and shows that backed the regime's goals. News was picked, made, and echoed to death. Every state win was honored as a marvel. Every technical move as a win of Aryan blood. Gazettes did not inform. They coached. Screens barely existed, but cinema became the big mass tool. Funny shows, history plays, country stories were out. All of them in some way held nationalist, racist, or martial themes. Maker Leni Riefenstahl outed in 1935 The Triumph of the Will. That film about the partisan event in Nuremberg changed spin into art. The shots showed gripped crowds, perfect rows of youth walking, Hitler coming from the sky like a holy being. The film was shown in academies, plants, female groups. The shots spoke alone. There was no open harm, but a strong, pretty trap. Order, control, and total faith were honored. And that message sank deep into a crowd that, after years of mess, wanted exactly that order. Games were also fused into the system. In 1936, Germany held the Olympic Games. Berlin was packed with banners, shrines, players, guests. Everything was set with a perfection that amazed the planet. The regime briefly hid the most savage parts of its path to show a kind face. Anti-Jewish notices were taken down. Hits halted. Even some Jewish German players were added as a planned move. For 15 days, Germany appeared like a modern, kind, lively land, but it was just a veil. When the lenses were shut, the tool returned to its usual beat. Communal existence, meanwhile, was becoming soaked in a new habit where everything was filtered through the party. Weddings were honored with rites honoring Aryan Germanic babies. Birthdays held state tunes. Kids' books told tales where the stars were blonde and the foes had curved noses. In every depot, office, or salon, there were images of Hitler. At rail hubs, notices told people of the need to watch for the inner foe. The Nazi salute was utilized to start classes, local meetings, stage shows. There were no neutral spots. Spin even reached the most minor items. Matchboxes held nationalist terms. Academy pads had the leader's face on the front. Mail calendars noted the big days of National Socialism. Solstice cards came with old symbols used by the regime. In the bazaar, Aryan items were proudly sold. Buying sweets or soap became a partisan act. Domestic existence was an annex of the state. Artists who did not align were pushed away, hushed, exiled. Bookshops stopped selling banned writers. Jewish or new musicians were swapped by pure players. Jazz was named bad. Art had to be real, brave, male. Building became big, cold, harsh. Culture was no longer a goal, but a show of power, and the crowd, used to manage buying, started to forget that it could pick. The typical resident, meanwhile, merged, some from belief, others from habit. Those who did not like the regime learned to act. Looks mattered more than thoughts. One could last if they knew when to salute, what to read, whom to avoid. Mass culture provided a dream of unity, a shared bond that was nice. There were walks, shows, honors, and also dread. But dread became okay when wrapped in tunes and banners. Thus, between nationalist tunes and set trips, between radio orations and edited films, the German crowd lived their warped life. Spin was not just a state tool. It was an aura. It was in the breeze, in the academy, in the plaza, in kids' beds. The resident mind was made day by day from youth. And after just a few years, millions of people could no longer see truth from lie, belief from echoing. They only knew they had to walk straight, grin on time, and say, "Hail Hitler," even if deep down they no longer knew why. Tourism, sport, and rest in Nazi Germany. Rest as an annex of the regime. By the end of 1937, the daily existence of the German resident moved in a seeming quiet. The wealth had woken. State tasks moved well, and the orations spoke of power, future, and unity. But that balance was false. Dread was no longer a side feeling, but a deep habit. And yet the crowd did not exist only under force. They also existed in a dream. The regime had grasped that it was not enough to watch. It had to trap. Not only to rule bodies, but to win souls. For that reason, in the years prior to the war, Hitler and his staff turned rest, sleep, games, and trips into spots of spin, control, and social bond. The group's strength through joy became a main actor in the existences of millions of Germans. This huge state frame under the German labor front provided trip deals, hikes, art hours, talks, shows, theater tickets, and cruises, all at low pay. Breaks were planned by the state. They were not basic trips. They were acts carefully made to bolster state identity, end class gaps, and grow the shared soul. The worker household that had never left its spot could suddenly see the sea, climb a peak, or sail to Norway on the grand ship Wilhelm Gustloff. The paths, however, were marked by a partisan story. Germanic history spots were visited. Talks were provided on the values of the empire, and shared meals were held where National Socialist tunes were sung. In each hike, There were party staff, tasked with seeing good acts and for noting any odd move. Every rest was watched, and monitoring, as in all of Nazi Germany, was taken as part of order. State trips also grew a lot. Visits to the peaks, the forest, and the old forts were sold. Geography was filled with state icons. Traveling became a nationalist act. Trip guides shifted their way. They were no longer neutral, but openly partisan. They described views saved from the Jewish soul, clean zones or spots of Germanic blood. Maps marked the spots with mythic value for National Socialism. Linz, Nuremberg, Berchtesgaden. Each step bolstered the notion of belonging. In the hamlets, rest time was also made. Plazas were packed with local fairs set by the party. Labor Days, Farmer Days, Mother's Days were honored always with walks, tunes, orations, and rites. Each date had a symbolic value to recall the weight of hand toil, to honor the babies of the Aryan woman, to thank the lead of the leader. In these shows, the line between party and control was invisible. Residents joined in bulk, not always from belief, but because being away could trigger doubt. Games clubs, which had grown during the Weimar era, were taken by the state tool. Fair play was swapped by partisan body training. Youngsters and teens got martial training masked as bodywork. Strength, grit, and loss were honored. Women were led toward gym tasks linked to mother health. The body was not a spot of liberty, it was a tool of the state. Mass game shows were also partisan. Open gym meets, player walks, and power tests were utilized to show the planet the life of the new German crowd. The top of this plan was for sure the Berlin Games in 1936, which still in 1938 and 1939 made waves in communal existence. Grand building, perfect shows, big moves, flares, banner walks. Everything was made to show the planet the image of a modern, tidy, and strong Germany. But that shot hid banishment. While German guests enjoyed their set breaks and residents watched ball games with state pay, Jews were already totally left out from theaters, pools, playgroups, and any kind of shared spot. Their exit was not only legal, it was physical, spatial, common. No one asked where they were. No one required their attendance. Teutonic relaxation was an ethnic benefit. The framework of common existence was also controlled. Promptness was a total merit. The partisan greeting had to be utilized at toil, at academy, even in greetings among peers. Classic politeness was swapped by forced loyalty. Attending the cinema, the stage, or a talk was no longer a personal choice. It was a path for showing loyalty to the government. Every spare act was packed with partisan themes. Even home honors merged with state catchphrases. At kids' births, state tunes were chanted. At weddings, old rites made by the elite corps were added. And at solstice icons were swapped by old marks or dark suns. Certain parts of the crowd started to feel a quiet gap. Thinkers, creators, residents not linked to the party. Folks with a sharp mind or merely tired of the state din felt that there was no neutral spot remaining. One could not read without vetting the writer. One could not talk without weighing the terms. One could not hear tunes without knowing their ethnic root. One could not stroll without meeting banners, images, lines of the leader. Existence became an endless walk. And in that walk, one could move or vanish. Simultaneously, many Germans, particularly adolescents, found a strong feeling of bond in this world. The strength through joy provided them acts they had never been able to experience before. The game walks gave them fame. The partisan groups provided them growth, honor, brotherhood. In the hamlets, myriads of males and females started to trust that Nazism was their solitary feasible land. The dawn of the 1st of September of 1939 started like many others in Germany. Receivers were switched on early. Gazettes were brought by kids on cycles. The standard flow of streetcars and workplaces starting in the major hamlets. But briefly before midday, a message broke the schedule. Adolf Hitler stated that after Polish acts, German units had passed the edge. Germany was at combat. The report was taken with a tangled blend of feelings, zeal, dread, fate, and compliance. Some cheered in quiet, others sobbed, but almost no one objected. For most residents, the start of the fight was not felt as an instant disaster. Spin claimed that this would be a brief, fair, cautious combat, a fight for the safety of the German crowd. The boulevards did not pack with grief, but with notices. Orders were given. Partisan meets were set. Bloc chiefs were called. The control the regime had forced over 6 years now started to work with martial care. The initial effect was mental. Chats shifted. Folks no longer spoke of the cost of grain, the breeze, or breaks with the strength through joy. Now they spoke of called-up mails, martial spots, charts. Folks viewed Europe with a fresh logic, not as an artistic spot, but as a fight zone. Broadcasters played state notes in a winning tone. The initial weeks were a chain of reports of moves. Shots of the German force passing Poland, the seized captives, the taken hamlets made a feeling of endless power. The early dread slowly dimmed, swapped by a martial joy. The most instant shift was the partial focus of the wealth. Young males started to be summoned. Many joined. Rail hubs packed with households, saying bye to their sons, kin and spouses with cheers, state salutes, and vows of win. But behind every waving cloth, there was dread. Women knew existence would shift. Aid groups were fast set. Teams to make cold gear for troops, grain gather webs. The task of women in the residence grew. Now they not only had to foster kids and serve the empire, they had to keep the home side. Civilian existence became martial from within. Academies started to act as hubs of moral teaching. Youngsters sketched tanks, practiced martial tunes, viewed maps of taken Poland. Activities were set in which fights were played out. Perishing started to enter school speech. The Hitler Youth got harder drills. Females in the League of German Girls were coached in the merit of loss, state mothering, and grit under stress. In every spot, checks, lists, and pleas for aid with the war task were grown. The state forced grain limits at fast speed. Order books started to be given that same fall. Each resident had to show a paper at the bazaar with marks showing their right to meat, grain, fat, eggs, sweet. Entry to coffee and cocoa was blocked. Swaps grew, grain coffee, plant butter, beet soup. At first there was order. Germans were coached to take rules. No one objected about waiting in line. But chats in the bazaars started to fill with murmurs with half-said lines. How long will this stay? My son is not feeding well now. Transit was also hit. Roads and locomotives were prioritized for martial use. Private trips started to be blocked. A night dark was forced in all hamlets. Glass had to be veiled with dark drapes. Street lamps were shut. Cars used dim lamps. There were big fines for breaking these rules. In many residences, glass was taped to stop bits in case of a blast. Shells had not yet dropped, but the land already lived as if under hit. Spin doubled its force. Every notice, every booklet, every radio note spoke of grit, unity, task. The shots showed grinning troops, proud households, kids sending notes to the side. Shows were set to lift spirits. State plays, shows with tunes from the side, displays of tanks and guns. Even fun had to serve the goal. Films showed German grit, the cruelty of the foe, the need for compliance, common speech filled with terms like people's community, mission, loyal. Private feeling was swapped by shared catchphrases. The Jews by then were totally away from the state group. If in 1935 banishment was legal, by 1939 it had become real and savage. The 9th of November of 1938 had marked a turning point. The night of broken glass, seared shrines, ruined depots, myriads of seizures and moves marked a final shift. From that point on, being Jewish in Germany meant existing in endless hazard. They could not hold radios, use state transit, get milk, or go out after certain hours. Households existed trapped, hushed. Sometimes peers assisted in secret, but most merely looked away. With the start of the fight, that state became more harsh. Jews were made to hand over their radios, cycles, pets. They were given zones of living, pushed from central rooms, barred from buying in many spots. Every week, a new limit. The Aryan crowd grew used to not seeing them or to seeing them as ghosts. Terror became usual. The harm prior to the fight, which in 1938 had been public, now gave way to a more systematic and quiet cleaning. Simultaneously, residents felt life started to shift. Partings, notes from the side, lines written in martial terms, the first notes of the hurt broke daily life. Grief became a constant chance. Women met to help each other, to share reports, to stitch or pray. Some older males were called up for office tasks. Teens hoped of going to the side. The youngest acted as troops. Fight entered residences not with shells, but through habit. At the same time, the regime used harder tools of social control. Meets were watched. Gripes were noted. Sad tunes were barred. Peers were told to report weak moods. Notes from the side were read by checkers. Phone calls could be tapped. The German resident knew they had to watch every term, even every move. Because the fight was not only held in Poland, it was also held in the parlor, in the bazaar, in the classroom. And yet, in the fall of 1939, many residents still trusted that the fight would be short. The fast fall of Warsaw, the signing of the deal with Stalin, the lack of instant martial move from France and Great Britain made a dream of win. The lightning fight appeared real. The sirens had not yet rang in Berlin. The fields were still green. Kids still played on the paths. The ruins did not yet exist. The home side as a spot of taking part and loss. The fight became real when cold came without enough fuel, when grain started to be darker and less, and when notes from the side stopped coming. If the start of the fight had been taken in 1939 with a blend of state joy and trust in win, by 1940 and 1941, the German resident crowd was starting to feel firsthand the daily load of a fight that did not end. It was not yet ruin, open shells or fall. It was the slow shift of life into a habit of lack, monitoring, and endless task. The hamlets were not trenches, but they were forts of a deeply moved backside. In residences, the fight sat into the smallest acts. Each family kept on the cook table a book with order dates, shifts for fuel, and dates for the aid drives of the winter relief, the party's winter aid plan. Mothers, far from moving back from public life, took a key task in managing lack. They learned to stretch fat, to swap milk with powder, to use root flour as a swap. Domestic skill became a form of state love. In peer meets, more than foods, plans were shared. How to cook bones a third time. How to tint a shirt with beet to hide its wear. How to talk the butcher into giving an extra bit of fat. The regime's spin honored this female work. Notices, booklets, and short films showed grinning mothers with blonde kids in tidy kitchens cooking with state pride. A female was no less a troop for not holding a gun. Her fight zone was the stove, the sink, the classroom where she taught the kids that dad was at the side and that win was close. The giving of prizes for the count of kids kept on, but with a grave tone. It was not just an act of honor, but a physical task. In neighborhoods, winter aid work drives became universal. Throughout the cold, party helpers went through residences, depots, rail hubs, asking for aid for troops, for widows, for the folks in need of the East. No one could say no. Aids were noted, Mrs. recalled. Small pins or papers were given to show the aid. Wearing the pin on the coat became as vital as lifting the Empire banner on state dates. It was a sign of social bond of belonging. Saying no even from poverty was suspect. Social control, although not yet as savage as it would be in later years, grew. Chats in soft tones, signs of tired, lines about the side were watched. In every block, in every plant, someone took notes. Radios were blocked. Only state hubs could be tuned in. Hearing external hubs was punished by jail or in big cases by move. Info was a straight line. Win after win, move after move. France beaten in weeks. The Netherlands taken without big fight. Norway held. The German resident heard the notes of the high command and trusted or acted to trust that the fight was almost won. Notes from the side started to take a variant tone. They were no longer just grand tales of move and glory, but short, weighed, and sometimes coded lines of the grit of fight. German troops who fought in Norway, in North Africa, or on the eastern side could not tell all, but they hinted at the cold, the lack of gear, the drain. Mothers read between the lines. Some seared the notes, others hid them. It was risky to show them. The terms from the side did not always match those of the Office of Spin. The people's community promised as a goal of ethnic and social bond became another gun of the regime. Shared nights were set for knitting, for reading fight notes, for hearing orations by the leader. Sameness was urged, not only in thought, but also in feeling. Pain had to be quiet, doubt hid. Those who sobbed in public were viewed with blame. Sadness became suspect. State love forced. Youth, meanwhile, were moved with more power. The Hitler Youth got a martial style. Teens got body drills, training with guns, lessons in maps, forced walks. They were taught to last with little, to bear the cold, to not sleep more than vital. By the age of 15, many already knew what it was to fire. They were openly ready for the day they would have to go to the side. The girls of the League were sent to the land to swap for males in the crops, to toil in offices, clinics, nurseries. Female labor ceased to be a rare thing. It became a need. State honors kept their rhythm, but their tone became more stern. They were no longer just walks of banners and void orations. There were shrines with shots of the fallen, lists of local troops, mothers with dark bands. In each hamlet, bookshop windows showed near the classics, the shots of side stars. Tales of fallen troops who died grinning with a note from the leader on their chest were spread. Death was honored, not as tragedy, but as fate, a fate that many were starting to take as certain. In plants, shifts were reset. Fight work grew. Staff got books with goals, skill orders, inner watch lines. Every bolt, every valve, every bin had to serve the cause. Errors were fined. Lapses noted. Free work was urged for extra tasks. Those who followed were gifted with papers, party meals, free passes to state films. Those who failed were left out. Holy life tolerated under watch was taken by the fight speech. Christian talks looked at loss, on compliance, on the need to ache for a bigger good. Many priests took the regime's terms, others stayed quiet from dread. Only a few dared to fight openly, but their words were weak. In spots, masses were packed with mothers praying quietly, more from dread than from faith. And yet, amidst this view of control, of tidy lines and dark kitchens, a kid-like hope still stayed alive. Most German residents still trusted that win was feasible. The shots of taken Paris, of shelled London, of beaten Greece fed the dream. It was thought that if all followed, if all held, peace would return. But that peace would be a peace of winners, a peace without Jews, without foes, without erratic ones. In 1941, with the move into the Soviet Union on, the empire reached the top of its growth. From the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, the chart appeared gray. In residences, new charts were hung. Mothers marked with pins the spot where their sons fought. Kids learned new names: Smolensk, Kiev, Rostov. There was talk of oil, of grain, of living room. And it was echoed that after this task, all would be done. The year 1942 signaled a major transition in the routines of German residents. The dream of a brief fight was gone, and with it the total trust in quick victory. Following the collapse before Moscow and the tough grit of the Soviet force, it became obvious that the conflict would not only linger, but would also call for even bigger losses. Joseph Goebbels stated it harshly in his oration of February of 1943, but the crowd already grasped it before hearing him. The fight had to be total, and that signified the home side could no longer act like a viewer. Every resident was now one more bit in the fight tool. Every act, no matter how small it appeared, had to serve the goal. Lack became a core part of common existence. Rationing, which at first had been taken with order and even a certain state pride, now turned into a certain fate. Meat vanished from the desks. Fat became a luxury. Grain was made with dark flour mixed with shells and starch. Ale was thinned down. Gear had to be fixed until it could no longer be patched. Mothers turned drapes into clothes. old shirts into linens, male boots into gear for kids. The catchphrase was basic: toss nothing away. All was helpful, all was used. The city crowd was the most hit. In industrial hamlets such as Essen, Hamburg, Dresden, or Berlin, the queues to get limited items started at sunrise. Mothers held fabric bags, empty cans, and books with swap foods. Sweet was swapped by syrup, milk by thinned powder. Soap was rare, and mothers cooked roots to make home soaps. The scent of sweat became usual on streetcars, in academies, and in workplaces. But no one complained because complaining was risky and because everyone knew that at the side the grit was worse. The state started to step even into the pantry. State foods made by party diet experts were spread. Books were given with tips on lasting lack: cook beans twice, mix coffee with scorched grain, cook without fat. Mothers' gazettes held parts with tips on how to make gear from covers or use paper as soles for shoes. Radios played health tips using cold water. The state said how to live, what to eat, and how to dress, and residents obeyed, even if they swore in soft tones. Need forced skill, but also crime. The illicit bazaar grew in rail hubs, on the paths of poor spots and in yards. Informal swap webs grew. A glass of gin could be swapped for 2 packs of smokes. A bit of pork cost a week pay. A link with a farmer was more prized than any partisan link. Mothers walked miles on foot or by cycle to reach country spots where they could buy tubers or eggs. They returned with their bags full, fearing state checks along the way. Trains were full of residents holding sacks, bundles, and bins with grain hid in their gear. The state knew the illicit bazaar stayed and fought it hard. Big fines were forced: fees, jail, and forced toil. Raids were done in bazaars. Bags were checked on trains. Checkers were sent into spots. State trials grew. In some hamlets, the names and shots of hoarders or foes of the crowd were shown on boards in front of city halls. But the tool was unable to stop the thing, because even staff, chiefs, and party folks joined. Everyone required something? Everyone bought or sold outside state paths, and no one was ready to die for pride. The fight task called for not only surrender, but growing body and heartfelt loss. Mothers swapped males in plants, offices, shops, depots, and streetcars. 2 shifts were forced. The catchphrase was to make without rest. Every tick mattered. Plants worked day and night. The stacks never stopped. In many residences, mothers slept with their gear on in case the siren rang. Kids grew up without dads and often without mothers. Academy was a spot of move. Teens were sent to toil in the land, in gun plants, and to build walls in the taken lands. Free time had vanished. So had youth. The felt tone of the land shifted. There were no more honors, no happy walks, and no set breaks. The strength through joy was mostly gone. Theaters shut more and more often. Stage became a luxury. Shows were swapped by spin talks. Speech grew darker, hard, vital, and final. Terms like bliss, rest, and grace were left away. Notes from the side spoke of mud, cold blood, and the notes sent to the side held scent, kind lines, and sketches from the kids. They were many times kind lies because in the home side folks sobbed too, but the sobs were hid behind the drape, far from the pier, far from the party, far from the block chief. The Jews who still stayed in Germany were pushed into a point of no return. Starting in 1942, their mass move to the east started. No one spoke of death. Clean terms were used: resettlement, toil in the east, move. But the trains left full and never came back. The peers knew it. Some assisted. Most stayed quiet. The residences of moved households were re-given. Their gear was shared. Their coats were used. Silence became guilt. Sin was masked as need. In the middle of all this, spin did not stop. Goebbels spoke of grit, of will of iron, and of bad crowds who wanted to ruin Germany. Dread was used. If Germany lost, the payback would be huge. There was talk of Marxism, of Slavic groups, and of Allied shells as signs of hate against German art. Every shell that dropped in Hamburg or Cologne was used to bolster dread. Loss was not a chance. It was a stated hell. That is why one had to hold. That is why one had to die, if vital. 1943, Stalingrad. Shared grief and gaps in trust. The state report came in February of 1943. The 6th German force had been wiped in Stalingrad. For the first time since the start of the fight, the radio did not play a win, but a ruin. It did not say so in those terms, surely. It spoke of brave grit, of loss for the land, and of endless honor. But the Germans grasped the note. Under the iron speech, a hard truth was hid. The fight was being lost, and with that certainty, something snapped on the home side. Not order, not compliance, but belief. Until then, even under lack, checks, and ache, most residents had kept a basic trust in the leader. The quick wins, the rule over Europe, and the image of the strong troop had kept alive a shared hope. But Stalingrad was something else. Stalingrad was a limit. Almost 300,000 troops sent to the ring. More than 90,000 captives, myriads dead, and among them sons, kin, and spouses. Loss was no longer a number. It was a note. It was a void chair. It was a name that never came again. In residences, a quiet, kept, and set grief was out. The state did not allow public shows of ache. Mothers who sobbed too much were marked. Partners who said no to their tasks were yelled at. Spirits had to stay high. Pride had to be shown. That is why pity notes came with a book. Your son fell for Germany. The rites were brief. The stones temporary. There were no bodies, only reports, and the feeling that the worst was just starting. Goebbels's oration on the 18th of February of 1943 at the Sportpalast sought to lead that ache. He called for total fight and called for more work, more task, and more order. He yelled that the foes wanted to ruin Germany, hurt their mothers, and burn their residences, and the crowd cheered, standing madly. But that cheer was variant from the old ones. It was not joy. It was rage. It was dread. It was despair. For the first time, the crowd felt that they had to fight not to take, but to stay alive. The logic of fight had shifted. Resident life became even more stiff. Every zone was reset. Plants doubled shifts. Mothers were called for industrial, office, and tech tasks. Teen girls swapped boys in land toil. Academy breaks were used to pick tubers, fix roads, and clean trains. Rest was cut, reading banned, shows halted, and theater limited to spin films. All else was seen as extra, even risky. The culture of talk grew. Trust among peers fell. No one knew for sure what was true. External hubs were heard in secret. There was talk of big shells in the West, of fast Soviet moves in the East, and of whole units vanishing. The state said no to all, but folks no longer trusted as before. In the plant, at academy, and in the office, terms were weighed more than ever. Loyalty was not taken for granted. It had to be shown daily, the greeting, the band, and the way of staying quiet when asked. In the hamlets, the material state fell even more. Darks spread. The lines to get grain became permanent. Empty depots, packed streetcars, and gear fixed again and again were part of the view. Forced reuse was forced. Gear, steel, fat, and paper all had to be given. The catchphrase was "nothing can be lost." But folks felt that what was being eaten was no longer just items. Spirit, power, and patience were being eaten. Notes from the taken lands also came. Some were starting to grasp what the camps in the East meant. Not everyone knew, but many thought so. There was talk of packed trains that did not come back, of whole crowds that vanished, and of males who came back with tales they could not tell. The check of knowledge was as hard as the check of feelings. To know was risky. To think so even more. That is why quiet became the home of millions. And yet habit kept on. Kids still went to academy. Mothers still cooked with whatever they found. Staff still pushed cars, worked tools, and made guns. Spin honored this grit as brave. It was said that the German crowd were variant, able to bear what no other could. In part it was true, but not from glory, rather from dread, surrender, and habit, because the choice was loss. And loss was no longer just partisan. It was a pit. In clinics, the hurt from the side filled the beds. Young males without legs, without faces, and without terms. They were shown as signs of loss, but their eyes said else. Mothers helped them in quiet. Kids looked at them in surprise, and dads deep down feared that their own sons would soon be there or would not be there at all. In residences, an old term was found: endure, not with hope, but as a rule, as the only path. The future had become dim. Folks no longer dreamed of win, but of lasting one more week. 1944, starvation, shells, and quiet grit. In 1944, daily existence for German residents became too much. On top of growing lack and the lack of males, now came a sure, loud, and daily threat: shells. Each day, hamlets were shaken by waves of air ruin that no longer respected time, spot, or breeze. The Allies held the skies. The clocks knew it as they stopped after every hit. The mothers knew it as they tallied their kids when leaving the bunker. The bakers knew it as they opened each dawn, without knowing if they would still have a shop by eve. The wall was no longer a far side. Now it fell from the sky. The noise of air sirens became part of the city beat. An alarm during the night meant moving down the stairs looking for a light, wrapping the kids, and packing into a bag the shots, the papers, and some grain. Many households slept in their gear. Mothers gave birth in basements. Elders said no to going down, ready to die in their beds. In makeshift bunkers, folks spent hours sitting in dark, breathing the same old air, hearing the drone of Allied bombers, and tallying the ticks between one falling shell and the next. Whole hamlets were left in ruins. Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Kassel, Leipzig, Essen, and Cologne. Where once there had been shops, cafes, shrines, and academies, there was now dust, bent steel, and bodies veiled with covers, and holes filled with water. Bodies were interred fast, often without names. In many spots, peers slept together at night in the few remaining basements. Privacy vanished. Folks lived in forced group, in shared dread, in the tiny hope of seeing the sun. Starvation, which had been managed for years through rationing, now turned into long-term hunger. Bazaars were empty. Fruit became a rarity. Meat a memory. Households stood in line for hours for grain that sometimes never came. Tubers were the main grain when there. Roots were cooked, peels were eaten. The swaps were no longer the rare thing, but the rule. Grain coffee, cooked cabbage soup, and flour mixed with wood dust. Aches from food gaps grew. Anemia, bone ache, and sickness. Kids stopped growing. Mothers stopped periods. The body fought as best it could. The illicit bazaar became vital, not just to last, but to find a bit of power. A kilo of fat could cost the same as a coat. A bit of pork was a cause for fight. Personal bonds started to rely on what one could find or swap. Links with farmers, rail staff, or hamlet staff were worth more than any thought. Taking grain from the state became a common act and was not seen as a crime among residents. It was habit. Theft, like lying, became another way to stay alive. State spin kept hitting with terms of steel. Goebbels ordered the hamlets to be tagged with lines like the leader rules: hold, total fight, shortest fight, or every loss counts. But something had shifted. The catchphrases no longer moved. Folks no longer viewed them. They no longer spoke on them. They stayed there but were like the bells of ruined shrines, hollow noises. In plants, staff followed from habit. On trains, Nazi salutes were given with void moves. The joy of 1939 was now mere habit. No one fought openly. But no one trusted anymore. Trust had gone out. Disbelief was not open. It was quiet. It was surrender. It showed in small acts of quiet grit, acting to be sick to avoid toil, on purpose breaking a tool, not fixing an office error, and hiding info. Some mothers said no to giving their young sons to the youth groups. Some teachers once again used banned rhymes in their classes. It was not a fight. It was a way to find honor, to feel human amidst the tool, and to say no without saying the term. Moral fall moved as well. There were kids who took grain from bodies, and elders who slept among dust. Mothers who gave sex for grain, for soap, and for smokes. Clinics were full. Graveyards had no more room. In many cases, bodies were burned with the trash. Shrines stood empty. The state god of the empire had been interred under the dust of every ruined shrine, every shelled home, and every rail hub that had sent Jews to the east and was now being shelled by the Royal Air Force. Land life, although less hit by the shells, was no better. Farmers were pushed to drain. They had to make with fewer and fewer palms. Slaves, Ukrainians, Poles, and Soviets were watched by the secret police. Some tried to secretly assist German residents who came from the hamlets in search of grain. Others were tipped off. The bond between land and hamlet grew tense and angry. Many farmers hated the party staff, but they did not say it. They simply shut the gate and went back to sowing. In the residence, mothers became the hub of all. They were nurses, cooks, teachers, seekers, and makeshift leaders of broken groups. Many no longer had spouses. Either they were at the side, or they had died, or had simply been lost. Sons grew up without help. Daughters took on adult tasks. The future had become a question without an answer. "What are we going to do after this?" was a line no one said anymore because no one could think of an after. 1945, loss, rule, and the end of the common Nazi planet. In the first days of 1945, Germans no longer spoke of final win. The term shifted. Folks spoke of lasting, of holding on a bit longer, and of saving the kids. In bunkers, in basements, on trains packed with mothers and elders fleeing west, chats were short, cut off by the din of tools, by sirens, and by despair. Cold veiled with a coat of frost the dust of hamlets that were nothing more than names on the radio. And in the middle of that breakup, German resident life went on warped, dragging itself along the sides of a falling regime and a group that no longer knew who it was. Loss came before it was signed. It sat into faces, into skin, and into bones. The hamlets were open graveyards. Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, Frankfurt, and Essen, all hurt, all open, and all weird. Folks walked among dust like ghosts. They looked for grain, they looked for water, they looked for their kids. Many times they found nothing. Some mothers veiled in ash walked the streets with carts in which they held a coat, a pot, and a bin of wet papers. They had lost their residence, their spouse, and their faith, and still they kept walking, because to stop was to let oneself die. The shells were no longer once in a while, they were habit. But what weighed most was no longer the din, but the quiet that stayed after. The shrine bells were hushed, the academies shut, and the plants ruined or empty. On many streets, not one glass was whole. Folks slept under broken roofs, cooked on makeshift stoves, and boiled snow to drink. There was no heat. Power failed. Radios were trash. The state had vanished. The party as well. Only the bits were left, the dirty gear, and the shots of Hitler left on piles of seared papers. Dread was no longer of the foes, but of the next day, of taking, of payback, and of the payback that came from the East in Soviet gear, and with hard faces. Stories spread of mass rapes, of deaths, and of payback. And they were not stories. The rows of folks fleeing Silesia, East Prussia, and Pomerania held on their faces the panic of what they had seen. Kids who did not talk, mothers who did not sleep, and males who hung themselves from trees to avoid being taken captive at hubs. Myriads tried to board trains that never came or came full of beaten troops, sick elders, and unburied bodies. German mothers, kin, and spouses became the last line of hold. Armed with cans, tools, and torn linens, they shielded their kids from the rain, the cold, and drunk troops. Some held death pills, a hid gun, or only a prayer. They shaved their heads, dirtied their faces, and acted to be sick to avoid the sure thing. Many were raped once, 100 times in front of their kids and in front of their parents. Honor became an impossible luxury. Life a mute brute act of grit. In the hamlets where U.S. units entered, the rule was variant, more tidy, less savage, but just as lone. The freed captives, the found camps, and the taken papers showed what many already knew, what others did not want to know, and what others acted never to have seen. The jail camps, the gas rooms, the pits, the lists, the shots, the names, and the piers, All was there. And now folks could no longer look away. In each taken hamlet, the Allies called for aid. Burials were set. The resident crowd was forced to walk through the camps to see the bodies, smell death, touch it, and tally it. In some hamlets, local heads killed themselves before having to face that truth. In others, they simply vanished. In academies, teachers were grilled. On the radios, state voices were swapped by external notes. In the bazaars, the new coin was the smoke, and fairness was quiet. The Nazi Party broke with the breeze. No one saluted with a stretched arm anymore. No one wore bands. Shots were burned, books hid, pins buried, and orations forgotten. Some party folks tried to go unseen. They shifted their names. They masked themselves as victims. Others were seized. Others simply fled. But the truth no longer required names. It was in everyone's eyes. In the empty residences, in the broken streets, and in the trains that no longer left. Nazi Germany did not fall like a deck of cards. It fell like a sick body that rots from within until it breaks. And in its fall, it pulled millions. Those who trusted, those who kept quiet, those who gained, those who lasted, and those who could not pick. All were left inside the same wound. In May of 1945, the fight ended, but peace did not come. Rule came, starvation came, trial came, memory came, and for millions of German residents, the hardest tick came, having to exist after having lasted, having to look at the past, having to tell it to their kids, having to fix a land not only ruined in its structures, but in its soul.